Have you ever imagined just how miserable the life of a medieval thief could be? Could you survive the harsh justice that pursued them, or navigate the chaotic alleyways fraught with danger and betrayal? Tonight, close your eyes and let the currents of time flow backward. We'll journey together to explore the less romantic sides of the past, where mere survival was a brutal struggle. Here at Dream Story Sleep, history isn't just dry facts, it's whispers from the past, slowly told to guide you into peaceful slumber. Beyond the tale of the thief and their gruesome punishments, you'll also hear about the haunting Victorian asylums, or even the inspiring story of Princess Warrior Cthulhu and fascinating nomadic medicine. Let our narration lead you through the corridors of time, where every small detail can unfold into an entire world. If you find peace in these stories, please don't hesitate to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts. It helps us bring more sweet dreams to everyone. Have you ever wondered what pushed an ordinary person onto a life of crime in the Middle Ages? Surely, in your mind, a medieval thief was probably an inherently rotten apple, a dark soul who simply reveled in sowing chaos and plundering others' possessions, right? But is the truth really that simple? Let's peel back the layers of time together, stepping into the dark alleys, bustling markets, and parched fields of the 14th century to uncover the story of a desperate choice, a life pushed to the brink. Life in the Middle Ages, as you might know, was no romantic, rosy picture filled with dashing knights or magnificent castles. It was a relentless struggle for survival, where every passing day could bring a new test. You wouldn't find food delivery apps or 24/7 emergency support services here. Oh no. Everything was crude, raw, and fraught with peril. So what transformed an honest peasant, a diligent craftsman, or even a brave soldier into a petty thief, a street robber, or a member of a dangerous criminal gang? Were they born with an inherently bad nature, or was there some force that drove them onto this inescapable path? Let me guide you through the far from romantic reasons, the brutal factors that turn someone into a thief in such an unforgiving society. Imagine this. You're living in a tiny village, nestled in the shadow of an ancient castle. Every morning you wake to the crow of a rooster, the chirping of birds, and a gnawing emptiness in your stomach. The harvest failed. Floods were relentless, or perhaps it was just a longer than usual winter, and then famine arrived. It wasn't loud like the clanging of swords in war, but it quietly gnawed away at every bit of hope, every ounce of strength within you. You toil endlessly in the Lord's fields, from dawn until the moon rises, but what you harvest is barely enough to keep your family breathing for a few days. Your children are sickly, their eyes silently pleading with you. Your wife, a strong woman, is now gaunt, her hands cracked from labor. Looking at those faces, what would you do? Could you sit idly by and watch hunger claim everything you hold dear? In such circumstances, is morality still a luxury? When your stomach growls, when the survival of your loved ones rests on your shoulders, the line between right and wrong becomes terrifyingly blurred. a loaf of bread from the wealthy baker's shop, a chicken from the plump monk's farm, or a few spare coins from a careless merchant, they suddenly become the only light in a dark tunnel. You might tell yourself, this isn't stealing, this is surviving, this is a fight for existence. Beyond famine, the Middle Ages had another uninvited guest, more frequent than even greedy lords: disease. There were no vaccines, no antibiotics, and medical knowledge was, well, we'll dedicate an entire chapter to the skilled physicians of this era later, shall we? Just imagine, one day a member of your family develops a high fever, a persistent cough, and frightening rashes begin to appear on their skin. It could be smallpox, consumption, or worst yet, one of the periodic plague outbreaks that swept through the village. You need medicine, you need a healer, you need nutritious food to sustain health, but you have no money. Your pockets are empty, your purse is bare, and hope is slowly draining away. In desperation, you run everywhere, begging for help. But everyone else is struggling with their own burdens. Neighbors shun you for fear of contagion. The Lord cares nothing for the fate of a peasant family. Death hovers right before your eyes, and you have to do something. A remedy bought from a charlatan at the market, some rare herbs you heard might cure the illness, all require money. And when money is nowhere to be found, where will you seek it? This is not a time to contemplate the Church's teachings or society's rules. This is a time to make a cruel decision. Will you let your loved ones perish in pain, or will you risk everything, even your soul, to find a faint glimmer of hope? Even if you were fortunate enough to escape famine and disease, there was still another burden weighing heavily on your shoulders: the medieval system of taxes and labor services. It was more convoluted than a village council meeting and almost impossible to escape. You had to pay taxes to the Lord to cultivate his land. You had to pay taxes to the church to be baptized, married, and buried. You had to pay taxes to use the village's grain mill, the ferry, or even just to be born or to die. Then there were other unreasonable labor services, like having to spend several days each week working on the Lord's land without pay, or having to contribute goods and food to the army in times of war. Every harvest season, just when you thought you could finally breathe a sigh of relief, a Lord's man or a church official would come knocking, a worn leather ledger in hand and a cold expression on his face, demanding what you had toiled so hard to produce. Sometimes they took so much that you were left with nothing to feed yourself and your family. How would you feel when you had worked tirelessly, sweated blood and tears, yet still couldn't cover those unreasonable levies? Injustice, anger, and then despair. Is there any justice when you are exploited to the bone? In such circumstances, taking back what had been taken unjustly, by any means, became a tempting thought. A nocturnal visit to the Lord's granary, a temporary loan of a few silver coins from the greedy tax collector. These might not be heroic acts, but they are the acts of someone pushed to their limit. In a world where survival was the ultimate priority, social rules and morality seemed to waver. That doesn't mean all people in the Middle Ages were amoral. On the contrary, religious faith was very strong, and committing a crime was considered an act against God. However, when a person is pushed to their absolute limit, when hunger gnaws, illness afflicts, and injustice presses down, the concepts of right and wrong can become very different. You might feel you have no other choice. You might rationalize that your actions are to protect your loved ones, to preserve life. This isn't a romantic or glamorous choice, but a desperate and risky one. You might start with small acts, like stealing a loaf of bread when no one is looking, or pilfering a few apples from a wealthy neighbor's orchard. Gradually, as fear lessens and need increases, those actions might become bolder. A break-in into a storehouse, a robbery on a deserted road, or even joining a larger criminal gang. Each step on this path is a trade-off. You trade peace of mind for a full stomach. You trade safety for a chance at survival. And then you realize that once you've stepped onto this path, turning back is incredibly difficult, sometimes impossible. The life of a medieval thief held no glory or romance like the stories we often hear. It was a life fraught with danger, loneliness, and constant fear. Every day was a gamble, every night a hiding. You always had to be wary of others, of the authorities, and even of your own comrades. And that is why you, an ordinary person, could become a thief in that harsh medieval era. It wasn't instinct, it was a desperate reaction to a cruel and unforgiving world. But the thief's journey has only just begun. Once you've stepped into the shadows, what trials await? And is there any path out of this spiral of danger and despair? When a person stepped onto the path of theft in the Middle Ages, their life was no longer peaceful. The quiet fields, the bustling market days, or the humble home that once offered shelter were now distant memories. Instead, a thief's life was a labyrinth fraught with traps and endless trials, a solitary journey in the shadows where every breath could be their last. Let us explore the dangers that constantly lurked, from the relentless pursuit of the law to the unexpected threats from those they thought were their comrades, and the invisible burdens that weighed upon their soul. Imagine this. You're a desperate peasant, forced to do things no one wants to do just to survive. Perhaps it was a rainy night when you sneaked into the Lord's granary, or maybe a late afternoon when you borrowed a few chickens from a plump monk. Your heart pounded like a war drum. Cold sweat trickled down your back despite the absence of heat. The item you needed was in your hand, but would you escape? That was always the biggest question. A question that hovered over every medieval thief, like a scythe of death always ready to descend. Facing brutal justice and unforgiving punishment. The medieval legal system, it had no concept of humanity or rehabilitation. You wouldn't find fair trials with impartial juries, dedicated defense lawyers, or educational penalties. Everything was very direct and brutal. Justice back then was often administered by local lords, town magistrates, or sometimes even the clergy themselves, and their standards seemed to be inspired by the darkest fairy tales. Once caught, the consequences were dire. You didn't just lose your freedom, you lost your honor, your body, and possibly your life. Try to imagine this scene. You are paraded through the crowded streets of a town, your hands bound tightly, your mouth gagged so your desperate pleas cannot be uttered. The crowd gathers, their gaze is not of pity, but of curiosity mixed with judgment, even hatred. Some throw stones, mud at you. Shouts and curses echo everywhere. This was the beginning of public humiliation, a brutal form of punishment intended to deter the entire society. Then you would be led to the stocks or pillory set up in the central square.
This was a wooden frame with holes to lock your hands, feet, or neck, exposing you to the gaze of everyone. Privacy? Absolutely none. You were forced to stand there, enduring the scorching sun or the biting cold, the jeers and the projectiles, often rotten vegetables or refuse, hurled by the crowd. This feeling of shame was worse than any whipping. Every glance, every sneer was like a dagger thrust into your soul, destroying the last shred of human dignity. And sometimes, being in the stocks was not just humiliation, but could lead to death if the crowd was too violent or the weather too extreme. If your crime was considered minor, you might escape the death penalty, but the punishment would still leave an indelible mark. Flogging was a common penalty, with leather whips lashing at the flesh, leaving permanent scars not only on the body, but in the mind. Worse still was the mutilation of a body part, often an ear or nose, as a permanent sign of guilt and disgrace. Think about it. A man missing an ear, or a woman with a disfigured nose. That was not just physical pain, but a perpetual social condemnation. No one wanted to associate with, no one wanted to hire those who bore the mark of a criminal. And then there was branding. A red-hot iron, often in the shape of the first letter of the crime, for example, T for thief, would be pressed firmly into the flesh, usually on the forehead, cheek, or hand. The sizzling sound of burning flesh, the acrid smell, and the searing, permanent scar. Whenever they appeared anywhere, that gruesome mark would betray their past, closing every door in their face. From now on, their life was a series of evasions, living in the shadows, disappearing like a ghost in the night. No identity, no future, only a pariah abandoned by society. Dangers from the underworld. You might think that if one cannot live honestly, then join a gang, where brothers in similar circumstances protect each other. But oh, life in the underworld was nothing like the romantic detective stories or movies you might have seen. It was a place riddled with fierce competition, insatiable greed, and empty promises. In a medieval thieves' guild or gang, trust was a luxury. Each member was a solitary individual, fighting for their own survival. The division of spoils was always the source of quarrels, envy, and even bloody brawls. A brother who just broke into a warehouse with them could turn around and sell them out to the guards just to claim the loot for themselves or to gain leniency.
Betrayal was an everyday occurrence. Who would stab whom in the back to get a bigger share, a more powerful position in the gang, or simply to avoid punishment? A thief always had to be vigilant, not only against those outside the law, but also against the very people they shared the darkness with. A thief living in a gang was someone who constantly had to look over their shoulder, never truly safe. The fear of betrayal was sometimes greater than the fear of being caught by the authorities, because betrayal from those closest would leave deeper scars than any physical punishment. The lingering battle with hunger and disease. Even as a seasoned thief, they could not escape the grip of hunger and deadly diseases. Don't imagine that successful heists brought them luxurious lives. Most of the spoils would be divided or quickly depleted by pursuits, nights on the run, and unforeseen expenses. A life on the move, wandering from one town to another, from one hill to another forest, meant that thieves had no stable home, no secure refuge. They often slept in damp caves, makeshift shelters in deep forests, or the filthy alleys of cities.
Poor hygiene, lack of clean water, and nutritious food were inseparable companions. Minor injuries, from a cut while climbing, a bruise from a fall, or a bite from a wild animal, could quickly turn into serious infections. Without antibiotics, without nurses or doctors to provide care, a simple wound could lead to gangrene, loss of limbs, or even a painful death. Common fevers, illnesses that we easily cure today, were death sentences for them. They would cough in the dark, tremble with fever, knowing that no one would come to help them. It was a persistent struggle, a vicious cycle of deprivation and illness, where death could come at any moment, without any grand reason. But perhaps the worst punishment for a medieval thief was not the lash marks on their back, or the brand on their forehead. It was the unrelenting psychological burden, an invisible prison that held their soul captive. The fear of being caught was a constant phantom, following their every step, every strange sound in the night, every fleeting light, every distant dog bark could make their heart leap from their chest. They could never truly sleep peacefully, always vigilant, always ready to flee. The feeling of being hunted turned them into wild animals, living in a state of extreme tension. Extreme loneliness was also a constant companion. While there might be comrades, that relationship was based solely on mutual benefit and suspicion. There was no true friendship, no trust, no one to share the burden of their soul. They were ostracized by society, considered the lowest of the low, the discarded. Families might abandon them, villagers shun them, and even the church closed its doors to their sinful souls. They lived like ghosts, with no place to belong, cared for by no one. And then there was the guilt that gnawed at their conscience. Although they might have embarked on the path of theft out of desperation, every wrong action left a scar on their soul. Their dreams were haunted by the faces of their victims, by the cries of children whose food had been stolen, or by images of brutal punishments. Could a person in such circumstances still retain any humanity? Would the light of conscience ever flicker back in a life hunted and filled with sin? It was very difficult to say. Even if they survived the hunts, the battles, and the deadly diseases, a thief's life was still condemned and abandoned by society. Once branded, they could not return to a normal life. Opportunities for work, for reintegration, were closed forever. They were trapped in a vicious cycle of crime and ostracism, a tragic fate that often had no escape. The life of a medieval thief, as you have seen, was a vicious cycle of danger, despair, and often a tragic end, where every step could be the last. And if you thought only thieves faced ultimate fear, let me invite you to discover other professions that were far worse in this dark era.
We've explored why someone might be driven to a life of theft and discovered just how perilous their existence was in the harsh medieval society. Cold, hungry nights, incurable diseases, or the crushing psychological burdens all were part of that desperate journey. But there's another aspect of a thief's life that might be even more terrifying: the relentless pursuit. So when the pursuit whistle pierced the night, the clatter of the guards' horses thundered behind them, and shouts of "Thief! Thief!" echoed through the streets, could a medieval thief truly escape the clutches of justice?
Have you ever imagined a breathless chase through the narrow, filthy alleys of a medieval town? There were no smooth asphalt roads, no street lights illuminating the way, and certainly no Google Maps to find the quickest escape route. Instead, there were rough, muddy dirt paths after a rain, or dust-filled ones on hot, sunny days. On either side, wooden houses crammed together, leaning precariously, their eaves jutting out as if to swallow the very space. Rubbish piled up everywhere. Sewage flowed freely, and the stench was overwhelming. Every step was a challenge, a risk of stepping on something undesirable. A sudden mud pit, a pile of animal dung, or a massive refuse heap could send a thief sprawling, slowing their precious escape. Could those chaotic streets, filled with obstacles and shadows, become their ally or their enemy? On one hand, the unorganized nature of medieval urban architecture could create countless hidden corners, nooks, and secret passages that only those intimately familiar with the area could exploit. A crumbling wall, a tall stack of firewood, or a bustling night market with cluttered stalls might offer a temporary hiding place. But, on the other hand, that very chaos was a double-edged sword. A sudden dead-end alley, a locked gate, or an uncooperative crowd could turn the thief into easy prey. The faint light from torches and oil lamps only made the shadows deeper, concealing not only the fleeing thief, but also the lurking dangers. And when pushed to a corner, was there any true refuge for these relentlessly hunted individuals? Medieval cities did not have modern sewage systems or vast underground networks like in movies. Sewers were often open ditches or narrow pipes infested with rats and diseases. Hiding under a bridge, the risk of being discovered remained high. Climbing onto rooftops, one slip could end everything instantly. Thieves often had to seek out places no one else dared to tread. The most squalid slums, eerie graveyards, or even dense forests outside the city walls, where wild animals and other perils awaited. These escapes were not just battles against the law, but struggles against the harsh terrain and environment itself. Every gasping breath, every frantic heartbeat was a testament to the imminent danger. In those moments of life or death peril, could other criminals be trusted allies? You might think that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But in the medieval underworld, that saying rarely held true. Instead, it was more like a pack of starving dogs, each ready to gnaw at the others to snatch a better meal or to save themselves. The reality was, other criminals were often more of a threat than a help. Trust was a ridiculously rare commodity in a world where each person cared only for their own survival. They might have shared a cold evening under the eaves of a ruined church with a fellow highwayman, planning a daring heist together. But as soon as the pursuit whistle sounded, that very person might be the first to point them out to the guards, to create a diversion, or to bargain for their own pardon. Betrayal came not only from strangers, but from those they considered comrades. A shove into a cesspit to shake off pursuers, a false accusation to shift blame onto someone else. These were common scenarios.
Competition within the underworld was fiercer than any struggle outside. There were no rules, no morals,
Only the strong and the cunning could survive. If someone was a new thief, they would be exploited and bullied by older, more established criminals, and, if not careful, could be sacrificed as a scapegoat for a failed operation. Even if they were a seasoned thief, there were always others seeking to usurp their position, steal their territory, or simply test their abilities. This internal conflict often led to bloody brawls, stealthy assassinations, or brutal purges to consolidate power. This was a battle for survival not only against the law, but a relentless fight among those who shared the same murky world, where the line between friend and foe was terrifyingly blurred. Consider the tools and means a thief might use to escape in such depraved times. No cars, no motorcycles, just their 2 feet and their wits. A deep knowledge of the terrain was an extremely crucial advantage. A good thief would know every nook and cranny of the city, every dead-end alley that led to nowhere, every wall that could be climbed, and every secret passage that led to the outskirts. They might exploit the sewer system, if it existed, and it was usually crude and dangerous, to disappear without a trace, even if it meant wading through the most repulsive filth. The ability to skillfully blend into a crowd was also an art. A quick change of clothes, pulling up a hood, or pretending to be a street vendor. These skills could help them vanish among hundreds of unfamiliar faces in a bustling market. However, even if they escaped once, twice, could they escape forever from the clutches of the law and their predetermined fate? The answer was almost always no. Each escape was merely a postponement, a brief breath before the chase resumed. Thieves lived in a state of constant vigilance, never truly safe. They knew that sooner or later their luck would run out, and the inescapable net would close in. A small mistake, a moment of carelessness, or simply an anonymous tip from a hidden enemy was enough to end everything. Furthermore, even if they successfully escaped, they still faced a lonely life with no future. They couldn't build a family, hold a stable job, or live a normal life under the sun. They were forced to hide, constantly change identities, and live in fear of being recognized. Every new city, every new face could be a potential threat. Their life was a series of endless escapes, a perpetual exile in their own homeland. After all those breathless chases, those hidings in the shadows, and those moments of confronting betrayal, was a thief's life merely an endless game of hide-and-seek, filled with treachery and without a clear end? Perhaps the answer is yes. It was a game where the rules were dictated by life's harshness, and the only reward was temporary survival. A life where every day that passed was a reminder that they were living on the brink of destruction, a fragile thread holding them to the world. And if you thought a thief's life was the epitome of misery and danger, just wait, because the Middle Ages held other fates, other professions far more terrifying and dark, where every day was a struggle not just to live, but to hold on to the last vestiges of humanity. We will explore that together.
Have you ever wondered, before the advent of modern sewage systems and convenient toilets, how human waste was managed in crowded cities? You might imagine it being simply dumped onto the streets,
And while that did happen to some extent, with thousands upon thousands of people living in an urban center, a more effective waste disposal method was necessary, no matter how repulsive it was. So was there a group of individuals who willingly, or were forced to, undertake history's most foul-smelling task? What was it? Yes, there was. We are about to explore the lives and the mysteries surrounding the gong farmers, the cesspit clearers, a job whose very name is enough to haunt you, to make you visualize the gruesome scene of their labor. The term gong farmer sounds archaic and unfamiliar, but it was a specialized term used to describe those whose duty it was to clean privies and cesspits, the deep pits that collected human waste in homes, inns, and public buildings before modern sanitation systems. Gong might derive from Old English gang or gong, meaning to go or to urinate. Or perhaps it referred to the noxious odors emanating from their work. Their job involved descending into deep pits filled with waste, using shovels and buckets to scoop out the feces and refuse, and then transporting them outside the city for disposal, often to be used as agricultural fertilizer, a fact no less appalling. Just hearing it is enough to make your skin crawl, isn't it? So how truly horrific was the nature of this work, not just physically, but mentally? You can imagine a job that smelled worse than rotting garbage on a hot summer day. The stench from the cesspit was not just pungent, it clung to every fiber of the gong farmers' clothing, every pore of their skin. It wasn't simply an unbearable odor. It haunted their minds, followed them home, permeated their clothes, their skin, and even their very breath. No matter how many times they washed, that smell seemed to never fully disappear. The stench was an inseparable part of their lives, an invisible mark society etched upon them. But the stench was not the only danger. This job also held other deadly perils that not everyone knew about, things that could claim their lives in an instant. One of the greatest threats was the array of terrifying infectious diseases. Human waste was an ideal breeding ground for countless bacteria, viruses, and parasites. No matter how much they tried to protect themselves, gong farmers could not avoid direct contact with pathogens. Diseases like cholera, dysentery, typhoid, or even the plague could spread easily through the fecal-oral route. A small cut on the hand, a splash of liquid into the eye, or simply inhaling airborne dust containing bacteria was enough to make them gravely ill, and in an era of rudimentary medicine, a common illness could be a death sentence. No less dangerous were the toxic gases that could kill in minutes. Enclosed cesspits often accumulated methane and hydrogen sulfide gases from the decomposition of organic matter. Methane is a highly flammable gas, and in confined spaces it could cause suffocation due to oxygen displacement. Hydrogen sulfide, also known as rotten egg gas, though pungent at low concentrations, at high concentrations could paralyze the sense of smell and cause rapid death by weakening the respiratory system. Many gong farmers died on the spot, collapsing and never waking up simply from inhaling large quantities of these toxic gases while working deep in the pits. They often worked at night to avoid public scrutiny and the heat, but the darkness concealed these lurking dangers. A small torch for illumination could ignite the methane gas, turning the act of cleaning a pit into a deadly explosion. And finally, one of the most hidden but horrifying fears, the risk of drowning in the very cesspit they were cleaning. Many cesspits were very deep, sometimes several meters. A slip, a crumbling pit wall, or simply exhaustion from working in such a toxic environment could cause them to fall into the thick, viscous waste, unable to pull themselves out. Death in a cesspit was not just suffocation, but an extreme spiritual horror, being submerged in the very abomination they faced daily. Why would someone accept such a repulsive and socially despised, ostracized job? Do you think it was because they had no other choice? Or was the remuneration large enough to trade dignity, cleanliness, and the risk to their lives? Surprisingly, the profession of a gong farmer, despite being reviled, was sometimes quite well paid. Because no one else wanted this job, demand was always higher than supply. Their wages could be higher than some other common laborers. For the desperately poor, pushed to the brink, with no land to cultivate, no professional skills, or no family to rely on, this might have been the only way to earn a living, to stave off starvation. It was a painful trade-off between survival and social contempt. We will explore their peculiar social standing. Gong farmers were outcast by society, considered the most unclean individuals. They often had to live separately, far from residential areas, and were avoided whenever they appeared. The pervasive stench that clung to them was also an invisible barrier, keeping everyone away. They were not allowed to participate in community activities, were not invited to ceremonies, and their children also found it difficult to escape the bad reputation of their parents. Although their work was essential for public sanitation and community health, especially in preventing epidemics, they were treated as the lowest of the low. This was a painful paradox. They were unsung heroes fighting disease, yet despised and shunned by society. Was the life of a gong farmer merely a continuous struggle with filth and stench, cast out by society and living in solitude, with no one understanding or acknowledging their silent contribution to a cleaner society? Perhaps so. They lived solitary lives, interacting only with fellow workers or reluctant clients. Every social interaction was dominated by stigma and revulsion. Their efforts in keeping cities cleaner and safer from disease often went unrecognized. They were anonymous heroes, doing the work no one else wanted to do, and in return received alienation and contempt. It was a burden not just physical, but mental, to be pushed to the fringes of society, treated as if they didn't exist, simply for doing an essential job. The life of a gong farmer is a vivid testament to what humans had to endure when faced with desperation. It was one of the worst, dirtiest, and most dangerous jobs in history, a reminder that sometimes, to survive, people had to do unimaginable things and accept living in a world where foul odors and contempt were constant.
What did people do with the dead, and what was the price? After having waded through the disgusting cesspits of the gong farmers, those silent individuals who lived amidst stench and contempt, do you truly believe that history has run out of jobs connected to the gruesome reality of death and human suffering? You might be thinking of professions dealing with plague victims or those who cleared battlefields.
But prepare yourselves, because we are about to step into another world, where the line between medicine and brutality, between life and death, becomes frighteningly thin, and where respect for the deceased seems to vanish, at least in the eyes of those who performed this particular work. Have you ever wondered, before strict regulations on donating bodies for science, where did brilliant medical schools and anatomists acquire corpses for study, to learn how to heal the living, to save millions of lives later on? We often visualize anatomy labs with detailed skeletons and anatomical models, but to gain that knowledge, scientists needed to practice directly on human bodies. And did a secret, fiercely condemned profession exist solely to provide this gruesome, raw material, regardless of all ethics and morality? Yes, it did. We will unveil the story of the body snatchers, or, ironically, the resurrectionists, those who exhumed bodies, thieves of the dead's peaceful rest. The name resurrectionist implied they awakened the dead, but not to grant them new life, but to bring them to the dissecting table. So, why did this profession emerge and flourish so alarmingly in the 18th and 19th centuries, particularly in England and other European countries? To understand this, we need to look at the medical context of the time. Medicine was making immense strides, especially in the fields of anatomy and surgery. Doctors and medical students realized that to truly understand the human body and how to cure diseases, they needed hands-on anatomical experience. Knowledge from books was insufficient. They needed to see, touch, and dissect. However, the supply of legal cadavers was extremely limited. Most European countries only allowed medical schools to use the bodies of executed criminals. The number of executed criminals simply was not enough to meet the growing demand from medical schools, where hundreds of students yearned for practical experience, high demand, scarce supply, and the inevitable rise of a black market. Was the pressing need for medical advancement enough to justify the conscienceless act of exhuming and stealing freshly buried bodies, disturbing the deceased's peaceful rest and shattering the hearts of grieving loved ones? For the people of that era, the answer was unequivocally no. Social ethics and religious beliefs considered disturbing the dead a heinous crime. People believed the body needed to remain intact for the soul to pass on or to be resurrected on Judgment Day. Therefore, the fear of body snatching was very real, causing immense pain to families who had just buried their loved ones. However, for the medical community, the advancement of science was paramount, regardless of the ethical cost. Primitive laws were also an issue. Stealing a body was not considered a felony, but merely a misdemeanor or a violation of graveyard regulations. Punishments were often just fines or short jail sentences, not deterrent enough. This pushed medical schools and scientists into an ethical dilemma, where they had to choose between the advancement of knowledge and respect for the deceased. How did the actual work of a body snatcher unfold in the dark of night, under a pale moon, with utmost stealth, rudimentary tools, and a cold heart? To avoid detection, body snatchers typically operated at night, immediately after the funeral, usually within a few days of burial, when the body was still fresh and not yet significantly decomposed. They would arrive at the graveyard with simple tools, shovels, spades, ropes, and large canvas sheets or sacks. Although their work involved digging, they didn't excavate the entire grave. Instead, they would dig a small hole at the head of the coffin, just large enough to lift the coffin lid or pry it open. Then they would use ropes or hooks to pull the body out of the coffin, often without lifting the coffin from the ground. This helped them avoid disturbing too much soil, reducing the risk of detection.
Was the fear of being caught, of being chased and summarily executed by an enraged mob, greater than the haunting prospect of confronting freshly buried bodies, sometimes already decomposing? For the body snatchers, danger was a constant companion. If discovered by a graveyard watchman, police, or worse, an enraged mob, they could be brutally beaten, even killed on the spot without trial. Many graveyards had to hire guards, build higher walls, or even install mort safes, sturdy iron cages around coffins, to protect newly interred graves. The snatchers had to work quickly, silently, and efficiently. They usually only took the body itself, removing clothes and personal items to avoid being charged with stealing property, as stealing property was a felony. Sometimes, for easier transport, they would even dismember the corpse before putting it into sacks. These were gruesome and cruel techniques, revealing the callousness and lack of empathy of those in this profession. However, not all body snatchers were cold-blooded criminals. Some were desperate individuals, driven to this path by extreme poverty. Others were greedy, seeing immense profit in the trade of dead bodies. The price of a corpse could reach dozens of pounds, a very large sum at the time, equivalent to several months' wages for an ordinary laborer. This created a complex criminal network involving brokers, enforcers, and even doctors and medical lecturers who, with blind eyes, accepted bodies of unknown origin. And it wasn't just grave robbers. There were also notorious murderers like William Burke and William Hare in Edinburgh, Scotland, who killed people specifically to sell their bodies to Dr. Robert Knox, aiming to earn money without the effort of digging. The case of Burke and Hare in the 1820s sent shockwaves through society, exposing the brutality of the cadaver market and forcing authorities to change the law. After all, was the life of a body snatcher, despite contributing in a dark way to the advancement of medicine, merely a continuous cycle of living in shadow, accumulating guilt, and being cursed by society, where the price of science and curiosity was the destruction of human dignity and the inconsolable grief of families whose loved ones were disturbed, unable to rest in peace? Most certainly. They lived outside the law, hunted and despised. Every penny earned reeked of grave dirt and the tears of the living. They had no future, no honor, and constantly lived in fear. Despite their abhorrent nature, it cannot be denied that body snatchers played a necessary role in advancing anatomy and medical development. Thanks to this raw material, doctors were able to gain a deeper understanding of human anatomy, practice surgery, and ultimately save more lives. However, the price paid was immense: ethical violations, public horror, and the profound suffering of grieving families whose loved ones were desecrated after death. The Burke and Hare case, along with public outrage, led to the passage of the Anatomy Act in 1832 in England, which legalized the use of unclaimed bodies, or those with no relatives to claim them, by medical schools. This significantly reduced the demand for stolen bodies, and the profession of body snatching gradually faded.
However, their story remains a stark reminder of what humans can do when driven by necessity, profit, and the absence of morality in a nascent society. However, if you believe this marks the peak of disgust and suffering in historical professions, then you are mistaken. But instead of continuing to delve into humanity's dark corners, can we perhaps find another story, a glimmer of light amidst history's bleak canvas, a symbol of strength and will triumphing over fate? Yes, we can. Let us leave behind the shadows of the past and let the flow of the narrative carry us to an extraordinary woman, an undefeated warrior of the vast steppe, who used her own strength and will to define her life, breaking every limit society placed on women.
In the dense darkness of medieval Europe, as the 100 Years' War dragged France to the brink of annihilation, a surprising light emerged from a secluded village. It was 1412, in the peaceful Domremy, when a little girl named Jeanne d'Arc was born into a devout peasant family. Jeanne's life passed as quietly as any other child's, revolving around the fields, prayers, and stories of a France buckling under the heel of English and Burgundian forces. However, destiny had chosen this girl for an extraordinary mission, one that surpassed anyone's imagination. When she was just 13 years old, the first voices began to echo in Jeanne's mind. She heard whispers from Saint Michael, Catherine, and Margaret. At first, they were mere admonitions about virtue, but gradually the messages became clearer and more urgent than ever. Jeanne was chosen by God to liberate France from the enemy's yoke, to legitimately enthrone the Dauphin Charles at Rheims, and to expel the invaders. Though frightened and confused, Jeanne's faith in the divine origin of these voices grew steadily, becoming an unshakable vow in her heart. In early 1429, at just 17 years old, Jeanne decided it was time to act. She left Domremy and went to Vaucouleurs to meet Robert de Baudricourt, the garrison commander there. Initially, Baudricourt scoffed at her, calling her mad and telling her to go home. But Jeanne did not give up. The young girl's persistence, fervent belief, and determined expression gradually convinced Baudricourt. He saw something extraordinary in her, and finally agreed to provide Jeanne with a small escort and a horse to reach Chinon, where the Dauphin Charles was hiding in despair. The journey lasted 11 days and nights, fraught with danger through enemy-controlled territories. Jeanne had to disguise herself as a man, cutting her hair short to protect herself in the chaos, an act that would later be used to condemn her. Upon arriving in Chinon, Jeanne faced another challenge. Dauphin Charles, timid and full of doubt, tested her by hiding among his courtiers. However, without hesitation, Jeanne walked straight to Charles, miraculously recognized him and knelt before him, astonishing all who witnessed it. The subsequent private conversation between Jeanne and Charles remains one of history's great mysteries. Its content was never revealed, but it seems Jeanne told Charles something profound, known only to him and God, enough to move the Dauphin's heart. Nevertheless, the court remained skeptical. Jeanne had to undergo a series of rigorous interrogations by theologians and clerics at Poitiers. She answered intelligently, sincerely, and unflinchingly, affirming that she was sent by God. Ultimately, the clerics concluded that she was neither a heretic
nor a witch, but a person of good morals and good intentions, opening the door for her grand mission. At that time, the strategically important city of Orléans was under tight English siege and on the verge of falling. If Orléans fell, the path to southern France would be wide open for the enemy, putting an end to the kingdom. In late April 1429, at just 17 years old, Jeanne, in shining white armor and bearing a standard depicting Jesus and angels, led a relief army into Orléans. Her appearance created an incredible wave of excitement and hope among the French soldiers who had grown too accustomed to defeat. Jeanne was not a formally trained military strategist, but she possessed keen intuition, extraordinary courage, and unparalleled inspiring ability. She revitalized the army's morale, making them believe that God was on their side. Jeanne immediately urged the French commanders to launch decisive attacks on the English fortifications. In contrast to the cautious tactics previously employed by French commanders, Jeanne displayed boldness and determination. She always led the attacks, regardless of the danger. In a crucial battle at the Tourelles fortress, Jeanne was shot in the shoulder by an arrow. But instead of collapsing, she bravely pulled out the arrow, bandaged her wound, and immediately returned to the fight, further motivating the soldiers. On May 8, 1429, the siege of Orléans was completely broken. The English army was forced to retreat in disorder. This victory was a historical turning point, completely altering the course of the 100 Years' War. From a war France had seemed to have lost to one it could win. Jeanne d'Arc, from an unknown peasant girl, became the Maid of Orléans, La Pucelle d'Orléans, a national hero sent by God to save France. Following the resounding victory at Orléans, Jeanne wasted no time. She urged Dauphin Charles to quickly advance to Reims for his coronation. Reims was the traditional city where French kings were anointed and crowned, a ritual of deep sacred significance that legitimized royal authority. Although Reims was deep in English and Burgundian-controlled territories, Jeanne led a swift military campaign. A series of important towns and cities, such as Jargeau, Mion-de-Loire, Beaujon, and especially Patay, quickly fell. In the Battle of Patay, the French army under Jeanne's command crushed a large English force, clearing the way for their march. Jeanne's presence created such a surge of morale that many cities on the way to Reims opened their gates to welcome the French army without a fight. On July 17, 1429, Dauphin Charles was anointed and officially crowned at Reims Cathedral, becoming King Charles VII of France. Jeanne stood beside him during the ceremony, holding her standard, completing a crucial part of the divine mission she had been entrusted with.
After the coronation at Reims, Jeanne wanted to continue the advance on Paris, liberating the capital from occupation. However, King Charles VII, now solidified in his position, became cautious and hesitant. He was influenced by court advisors who were jealous of Jeanne's growing influence and preferred negotiation over battle. The delay in attacking Paris missed a golden opportunity. Finally, in September 1429, an attack on Paris was launched, but it did not receive full support from the king. Jeanne once again bravely led the assault, but she was wounded in the leg. The French army had to retreat with heavy losses. This defeat weakened Jeanne's position at court,
and strengthened the skepticism of her opponents. In the following months, Jeanne continued to fight in smaller campaigns, but she no longer received the strong support she once had. In May 1430, during a skirmish at Compiègne, Jeanne attempted to defend the city from a Burgundian siege. While retreating after an attack on the Burgundian forces, the gate was unexpectedly closed, cutting Jeanne off from her troops. She was surrounded and captured by a Burgundian soldier. This was a severe blow to French morale. Unfortunately, King Charles VII made no significant effort to ransom or rescue Jeanne, despite her pivotal role in putting him on the throne. After her capture, Jeanne was sold to the English for 10,000 livres tournois. She was taken to Rouen, the English capital of Normandy, to be tried by an ecclesiastical court headed by Pierre Cauchon, Bishop of Beauvais. Cauchon was an ally of the English and Burgundians, and he had clear political motives to condemn Jeanne. The trial began in February 1431 and lasted for months. It was an unjust trial, riddled with irregularities. Jeanne was imprisoned in an English military jail without a lawyer and faced dozens of hostile clerics and scholars. She was interrogated about every aspect of her life, from her divine voices to wearing male clothing to her military activities. Jeanne, an uneducated peasant girl, displayed astonishing intelligence, courage, and steadfastness in her defense. She never denied her voices or her mission, always asserting that she acted under God's command. However, the court sought every means to trap her. One of the main accusations was wearing male clothing, deemed to be against divine law. Although Jeanne explained that it was for her protection while traveling and fighting, and also at the command of the saints, the court still considered it a grave sin. After months of intimidation, coercion, and isolation, in May 1431, Jeanne was forced to sign a confession, renouncing her errors and promising not to wear male clothing again. She was sentenced to life imprisonment. But just a few days later, Jeanne once again wore male clothing, possibly due to deception, coercion, or simply to protect herself in prison. This act was deemed relapse into heresy by the court, an unforgivable offense. On May 30th, 1431, Jeanne d'Arc was led to the old market square in Rouen. At just 19 years old, she was burned alive at the stake. Her last words were a prayer to Jesus. Her ashes were scattered into the Seine to prevent the collection of relics. Jeanne d'Arc's death was a heartbreaking tragedy, the sacrifice of a young woman who had given everything for her country.
As Charles VII's crown settled firmly upon his head, and the triumphant cries of Jean la Pucelle slowly faded into the celebratory air, a darker, more insidious specter began to loom over Jeanne. To those who had lost power and territory to her, the arrogant English and their deeply resentful Burgundian allies, Jeanne was no heroine or messenger of God. She was a fanatical zealot, possessed by demons, a threat not only to the throne but to the divine order itself.
It was in this ingrained hatred and profound fear that a chilling script was meticulously drafted to defame and ultimately destroy her. After her glorious military triumphs, Jeanne gradually felt the chilling indifference from the very French court she had served. King Charles VII, now safely ensconced on his throne, opted for a path of extreme caution, even cowardice, instead of pressing the advantage Jeanne had so miraculously delivered. The king's advisers, perpetually jealous of the peasant girl's extraordinary influence, incessantly encouraged Charles to pursue murky negotiations rather than direct confrontation. Jeanne, with her burning zeal and unshakable faith in her divine mandate, tirelessly urged an immediate assault on Paris, but her pleas fell on deaf ears. The attack was inexplicably delayed, and when it finally occurred, Jeanne was tragically abandoned in battle, wounded, and denied the vital support she needed. This disastrous setback not only eroded her standing, but also provided ample ammunition for her detractors to sow seeds of doubt about her sanity. And then the inevitable grim fate descended. In May 1430, during a skirmish outside the city of Compiègne, Jeanne was surrounded and captured by Burgundian forces. This event was nothing short of a divine gift for her enemies. The English, in particular, desired not merely to eliminate a formidable military commander, but to utterly shatter the symbol of hope that Jeanne embodied. Their plan was chillingly clear. They would not simply kill her as a prisoner of war. Instead, they would transform her into a heretic, a madwoman possessed by demons, thereby discrediting all French victories and annihilating the faith she had inspired. Most tragically, Charles VII, the very king whom Jeanne had risked her life to enthrone, made no discernible effort to ransom or rescue her. This profound abandonment remains an indelible disgrace in the annals of French royalty. Jeanne was subsequently taken to Rouen, the English capital of Normandy, to face an ecclesiastical trial. This trial was orchestrated and presided over by Bishop Pierre Couchon, an ambitious cleric fiercely loyal to English interests. The true objective was unequivocally not to seek truth or justice, but to systematically demolish Jeanne's reputation and legitimacy. The proceedings commenced in February 1431, dragging on for months in an oppressive atmosphere of bias and hostility. She was held captive in an English military prison, shackled and completely deprived of legal counsel. She, an uneducated peasant girl, was forced to confront dozens of hostile clerics and learned scholars who relentlessly sought to twist her words and ensnare her with complex theological questions about her divine voices and especially her unwavering insistence on wearing male clothing. To the judges and her enemies, Jeanne's voices and visions were not signs of holiness, but undeniable proof that she was either possessed by a demon or afflicted with profound madness. They believed that if they could prove Jeanne was genuinely insane, then all her actions and declarations would become worthless, and the miraculous victories she brought to France could conveniently be attributed to malevolent forces rather than divine intervention. This was an extraordinarily insidious psychological strategy aimed at deeply instilling doubt in the minds of the French populace, thereby undermining their belief in her sacred mission. Some modern historians even speculate that the judges deliberately sought to exploit any sign of unusual behavior or hallucination to bolster the accusation that John was a madwoman, a sleepwalker manipulated by dark magic. They incessantly interrogated her about the specific details of her voices, hoping to find contradictions or bizarre testimonies that could be used to brand her as mentally ill or under the influence of sorcery.
Alone amidst her formidable captors, Joan defended herself with extraordinary intellect, astonishing courage, and an unshakable faith that defied all attempts to break it. She steadfastly maintained that her voices were indeed from God, and that she acted solely under divine command. When accused of wearing male attire, a perceived abomination to God and contrary to Christian morality, she calmly explained that it was a practical necessity for her own protection in the dangerous military environment, and furthermore that it was at the specific instruction of the saints themselves. However, the biased court dismissed all her legitimate defenses. They relentlessly sought to distort her words, looking for any minor loophole to condemn her for heresy and unchristian conduct. The judges employed every psychological torment, from explicit threats of brutal torture to extreme isolation, in a relentless effort to force her confession. In May 1431, under immense pressure and facing the terrifying threat of immediate immolation, Joan was coerced into signing a recantation, ostensibly renouncing her errors and promising never again to wear male clothing. She was sentenced to perpetual imprisonment. It seemed a resounding victory for those who had so meticulously plotted her downfall, an apparent end to the legend of Joan. But just a few days later, in an act of defiant resolve, or perhaps through deception amidst her brutal captivity, Joan was once again found wearing male clothing. This act was immediately seized upon by the court and deemed a relapse into heresy, an unforgivable crime that left no possibility of reprieve. The death sentence was sealed. On May 30th, 1431, at the tender age of 19, Joan of Arc was led to the old market square in Rouen. Before the trembling gaze of a crowd, some horrified, some morbidly curious, she was burned alive at the stake. Her final words were a heartfelt prayer to Jesus. To ensure no relics or venerated remains of her could be collected, Joan's ashes were meticulously scattered into the Seine. It was a cruel attempt to obliterate every trace of the heroine, to prevent her from ever becoming a saint. But this very tragic and profoundly unjust death ironically became the eternal flame that forever illuminated Joan's name. Those who tried and killed her may have believed they had extinguished her light, but in reality they only caused it to burn brighter, fiercely, in the hearts of the French people. The accusations of madness or demonic possession ultimately failed miserably. Just 25 years later, a retrial was formally opened at the request of Joan's family and with the full backing of King Charles VII himself. In 1456, Joan d'Arc was unequivocally declared innocent. All previous charges against her were summarily dismissed.
And then, in 1920, the Catholic Church officially canonized her, transforming her into Saint Joan of Arc, a revered saint, an indomitable heroine, an enduring symbol of courage, unwavering faith, and the extraordinary resilience of a woman who dared to stand up against and ultimately transcend the formidable political and ecclesiastical powers of her era. The insidious conspiracies to brand her as insane or a heretic ultimately only served to highlight the beauty of truth and her magnificent, unshakable legacy.
In the tumultuous 15th century of Europe, where the power of the throne was often implicitly reserved for the hands of men, a mighty voice rose from the kingdom of Castile, reshaping the destiny of an entire continent. That was Isabella I, a queen who wore not only the crown of power, but also carried within her heart a steel vision and an unwavering will. She transformed a fragmented kingdom into a unified global power, extending its reach across the seas to change the entire world. Isabella's life did not begin with the lavish days typically associated with a princess. Born in 1451, the daughter of King John II and his second wife, Isabella of Portugal, the young girl grew up in humility and relative obscurity. After her father's death in 1454, her half-brother, Henry IV, ascended to the throne. Isabella and her mother were sent to Arevalo, living in surprisingly modest conditions and isolated from the court, where they received little attention. Despite this, the young Isabella received a careful education in religious subjects, history, literature, and, crucially, the art of household management, knowledge that would prove invaluable in her later life. As Isabella matured, she became a pivotal pawn in the intricate political machinations of Castile. Henry IV's reign was plagued with chaos, with no clear male heir, and Isabella's position became a focal point for vying noble factions. Following the mysterious death of her half-brother Alfonso, Isabella was declared the rightful heir by the rebellious nobility. Yet, instead of plunging into a bloody civil war, Isabella displayed her sharp political acumen. At the Treaty of Toros de Guisando in 1468, she skillfully negotiated to be formally recognized by King Henry IV as the legitimate heir to the kingdom, in exchange for a promise not to marry without his consent, a promise she knew she would eventually have to break. Isabella's most crucial decision, and perhaps the single most important event that shaped the future of Spain, was her marriage to Ferdinand II of Aragon. Despite numerous other lucrative marriage proposals, and in direct defiance of Henry IV's wishes, who preferred her to marry King Afonso V of Portugal to solidify an alliance, Isabella's heart and mind were set on Ferdinand, a distant cousin and heir to the Aragonese throne. Their marriage took place secretly on October 19, 1469, in Valladolid, a bold act that required a papal dispensation, which they cleverly secured through an initially forged document. This marriage was not merely a personal union, but the very foundation for the unification of Spain.
When King Henry IV died in 1474, Isabella formally ascended to the throne as Queen of Castile. However, her reign was far from tranquil. Her claim to the succession was immediately challenged by her niece, Juana la Beltraneja, supported by King Afonso V of Portugal, igniting the War of the Castilian Succession, 1475 to 1479. Isabella, standing firm alongside Ferdinand, who was proclaimed King of Castile alongside her, though his power in Castile was largely symbolic, courageously led her armies. She was not only a ruler, but also an exceptional military organizer, ensuring her troops were well equipped and trained. Ultimately, they secured a decisive victory, firmly solidifying her rule. In 1479, Ferdinand also became King of Aragon upon his father's death. Although Castile and Aragon remained distinct kingdoms with their own laws and institutions, their joint rule as the Catholic monarchs, los Reyes Católicos, a title bestowed upon them by Pope Alexander VI, laid the groundwork for a unified Spanish nation.
Under the joint rule of Isabella and Ferdinand, Spain witnessed significant conquests that unified its territory and established a powerful nation. The pinnacle of these efforts was the Reconquista of Granada. For nearly 800 years, the Iberian Peninsula had been divided by the boundaries between Christian kingdoms and Muslim emirates. Isabella and Ferdinand dedicated all the kingdom's resources to bringing this prolonged conflict to an end. After a protracted and costly 10-year war, 1482 to 1492, Granada, the last Muslim stronghold in Spain, fell on January 2, 1492. This event was not merely a brilliant military triumph, but also the culmination of the Christianization process of the Iberian Peninsula, symbolizing the religious unity of the kingdom. Isabella was also a formidable reformer, possessing a far-sighted vision aimed at consolidating royal power and building an efficient kingdom. She skillfully curbed the unruly power of the nobility and military orders, gradually establishing a strong, centralized monarchy. She reorganized the Santa Hermandad, Holy Brotherhood, into an effective rural police force that helped maintain order and reduce crime, particularly banditry by noble factions. The justice system was reformed, ensuring more equitable justice and reducing corruption. The Queen also diligently worked to restore the nation's finances, healing the economic wounds inflicted by previous civil wars. However, Isabella's religious policies, driven by her deep piety and desire for religious uniformity, also cast dark, tragic shadows. With papal permission, she and Ferdinand re-established the Spanish Inquisition in 1478. Although its initial stated purpose was to ensure the orthodoxy of Jewish and Muslim converts to Christianity, conversos and moriscos, it quickly became a potent tool for social control and the suppression of dissent, causing immense fear and suffering. The apex of this severity was the Alhambra Decree of 1492.
In the same year as the conquest of Granada, Isabella and Ferdinand issued the decree expelling all unconverted Jews from Spain. An estimated 100,000 to 200,000 Jews were forced to abandon their homes and possessions, leading to significant economic and cultural losses for Spain, while causing untold suffering for the Jewish community. Subsequently, a policy of forced conversion was also applied to the remaining Muslims, stripping them of their religious freedom. Perhaps Isabella's most renowned legacy, one that utterly transformed the global landscape, was her pivotal role in patronizing the expedition of Christopher Columbus. After years of being rejected by other European nations, Columbus turned to the Castilian court as a last hope. Although initially met with skepticism from royal advisors, Isabella, with her remarkable foresight and keen intuition, recognized the immense potential in Columbus's audacious plan. She committed to funding his voyage in 1492, a decision that ushered in the Age of Discovery and laid the groundwork for a vast Spanish empire spanning the New World. The newly discovered lands in the Americas brought not only immense wealth, gold, silver, and natural resources, but also extended Spain's influence across the globe, establishing it as one of the world's foremost powers for centuries to come. Isabella I breathed her last on November 26, 1504. She left behind a kingdom more unified, stronger, and far wealthier than when she had ascended the throne. She had achieved one of her greatest ambitions, the creation of a unified and powerful Christian Spain. The assessment of Isabella remains a complex and multifaceted topic in history. She is lauded as a brilliant leader, a reforming queen who consolidated royal power, established order, and initiated a golden age for Spain with the discovery of the New World. She was a woman of extraordinary power and influence in her era, breaking many gender barriers. However, her religious policies, particularly the re-establishment of the Inquisition and the expulsion of Jewish and Muslim communities, caused immense suffering, irreparable cultural loss, and are widely condemned as brutal and inhuman by modern standards. Nevertheless, it is undeniable that Isabella I of Castile stands as one of the most significant monarchs in European history. She left a lasting legacy, not only shaping Spanish identity, but also profoundly influencing the global landscape for centuries thereafter. Her story is an epic tale of power, faith, and their far-reaching consequences.
In the thick mists of 15th-century England, as the red and white roses began to stain the green fields with blood, a woman rose like a fierce flame, burning through all prejudices and challenges. That was Margaret of Anjou, a queen born to royal titles, but raised in hardship, destined to become the iron heart of the Lancastrian faction in the fratricidal civil war known as the Wars of the Roses. Margaret first cried out on March 23, 1430, in the picturesque region of Lorraine, France. Her father, René, though bearing the title Duke of Anjou and theoretically King of Naples, Sicily, and Jerusalem, was in reality a poor ruler, with kingdoms that existed mostly on paper.
Margaret's early life wasn't enveloped in royal luxury, but steeped in political calculations, vague agreements, and chronic financial deficits. Her family, despite their royal lineage, lacked the resources and actual influence to guarantee a peaceful future for their daughter. Margaret grew up in an environment where survival depended on fragile alliances, tenuous promises, and mounting debts. This upbringing forged in her a shrewdness and a practical vision rarely seen in pampered princesses. In 1445, at the age of 15, this young woman was married to King Henry VI of England. This marriage was not born of love or personal choice, but was an integral part of a controversial peace treaty, brokered by the Earl of Suffolk, intended to end the exhausting Hundred Years' War. The accompanying condition made Margaret the focal point of all criticism even before she set foot on English soil. England had to cede the territories of Maine and Anjou to France. This was a bitter pill for the English nobility and populace, who were already exhausted and discontented after decades of war that yielded no desired results. From the moment she arrived in England, Margaret faced the cold hostility of the court and the common people, who viewed her as the Frenchwoman, a traditional enemy, and the direct cause of humiliating territorial losses. She was not welcomed as a queen, but as a symbol of defeat and concession. King Henry VI of England, Margaret's husband, was a man so gentle as to be weak, a devout scholar engrossed in scriptures and knowledge, but utterly lacking the iron will, decisive ability, and inherent fortitude required of a king in such tumultuous times. He was more suited to the life of a monk or a scholar than a ruler. His deep religious faith was sometimes misunderstood as indecisiveness, and his kindness was often exploited. From 1453, Henry began to suffer from severe bouts of mental illness, rendering him completely incapable of ruling. During these periods, Henry became oblivious to the world around him, speaking no words, responding to no one, and even failing to recognize his wife and son. The burden of the kingdom, of a throne shaking to its very foundations, abruptly fell upon Margaret's slender yet resilient shoulders. Despite being a woman in a deeply patriarchal society, constrained by countless rules and prejudices, Margaret had no choice but to become the guardian of the Lancastrian monarchy, the only one capable of keeping the ship of state from sinking. Margaret's greatest challenge was the rise of Richard, Duke of York. Richard was not only one of England's wealthiest and most powerful nobles, but also a descendant of Edward III through both lines, possessing a strong claim to the throne. He represented a formidable faction with many supporters among the nobility discontented with the Lancastrian court. When Henry VI plunged into a severe state of mental incapacity in 1453, Richard seized the opportunity to assume the powerful position of protector of the realm, controlling the court and national finances. Margaret's anxiety escalated into profound fear when she gave birth to a son named Edward of Westminster in the same year. The birth of an heir solidified the future of the Lancastrian line, but also intensified the extreme tension with York, who now felt permanently sidelined from the throne and directly threatened by Prince Edward's very existence. The conflict between the two houses became irreconcilable. When Henry VI temporarily recovered in 1455, Margaret, with the determination of a mother protecting her child and a queen defending her throne, immediately sought to remove Richard from all positions of power. She distrusted Richard and saw the inevitable threat he posed to her son. This action was the final straw, igniting the First Battle of St. Albans on May 22, 1455. This was the first large-scale military engagement, marking the official outbreak of the Wars of the Roses. Although this battle was not decisive, it left a deep scar. Blood had been shed, and the conflict between York and Lancaster could no longer be resolved by peace or fragile treaties. With Henry VI frequently ill and utterly incapable of making any significant decisions, Margaret of Anjou became the unofficial leader, the heart and mind of the Lancastrian faction. She was an unyielding mother, ready to sacrifice everything, including her reputation and personal safety, to protect her son Edward's inheritance. Her image during this period was described by her supporters as a lioness queen, courageous, decisive, and ruthless when necessary to protect her family and crown. Margaret overcame all social barriers and gender prejudices to display extraordinary leadership abilities. She unyieldingly mobilized armies, rallied loyal allies from across the lands, and even personally directed numerous military campaigns. She frequently moved across England, constantly persuading nobles to support her, despite being a woman in a harshly patriarchal society. Her talent was not only in her organizational skills, but also in her ability to inspire and maintain the loyalty of her troops, who constantly faced hardship and betrayal.
Large and bloody battles erupted consecutively. The Battle of Blore Heath and the Battle of Ludford Bridge in 1459 were bitter defeats for Lancaster, forcing Margaret and Henry to flee. However, she quickly regrouped her forces and achieved a resounding victory at the Battle of Wakefield on December 30, 1460, where Richard of York and his son Edmund, Earl of Rutland, were killed. York's death was a huge triumph for the Lancastrians and a testament to Margaret's iron resolve. However, this joy was short-lived. The Lancastrian army, though victorious, became undisciplined and plundered as they marched south, terrifying the populace and pushing many neutral nobles towards the Yorkist cause. The peak of the brutality was the Battle of Towton on March 29, 1461, fought in a fierce snowstorm. This was one of the bloodiest battles in English history, with tens of thousands dead. The result was a devastating defeat for the Lancastrian side, forcing Margaret, Henry VI, and Prince Edward to flee England, seeking refuge in Scotland and then France. Henry VI, with his illness relapsing and his spirit broken, became almost a burden, leaving the entire weight of the resistance on his wife. Throughout her harsh years of exile, 1461 to 1471, Margaret tirelessly sought support. She traveled across European courts, particularly in France and Burgundy, trying to persuade kings and dukes to help her reclaim her lost throne. She faced countless difficulties, severe financial hardship, and was often viewed as a destitute wretch, a queen without a crown, desperately seeking pity. Humiliating meetings, empty promises, and slammed doors could not deter her. She accepted every risk, every indignity, to maintain the hope of restoring her dynasty.
In one of her final desperate efforts, Margaret made a bold and surprising decision, showcasing her extraordinary political flexibility. An alliance with her former enemy, Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, once known as the Kingmaker, for his ability to manipulate the throne. Warwick had turned against King Edward IV, son of Richard of York, after feeling betrayed, and saw an opportunity to restore his power by returning Henry VI to the throne. This unlikely alliance temporarily restored Henry VI to the throne in October 1470. However, this brief joy was fleeting. In 1471, Edward IV returned to England with a formidable army, determined to reclaim what he had lost. In a swift and ruthless campaign, he successfully defeated and killed Warwick at the Battle of Barnet, April 14, 1471. Margaret, upon hearing of this defeat, landed in England with Prince Edward and their remaining forces, but it was too late. In the Battle of Tewkesbury, May 4, 1471, the Lancastrian forces were utterly and completely routed. This was a double tragedy, the final annihilating blow to Margaret. Her only son, Prince Edward of Westminster, was killed during or immediately after the battle. Edward's death was not only the grief of a mother losing her only child, but also the definitive end of the Lancastrian line, stripping them of any hope of inheriting the throne. Everything Margaret had fought for, every sacrifice, every effort, became meaningless. Margaret of Anjou was captured after the Battle of Tewkesbury and held prisoner for several years, mostly in the grim isolation of the Tower of London. She spent her final days in despair, witnessing the complete collapse of the dynasty she had sacrificed her life to protect. Finally, she was ransomed by King Louis XI of France in 1475 under the Treaty of Picquigny, the ransom money being the very lands Henry VI had ceded to France upon their marriage. She lived out the rest of her life in poverty and obscurity in France, haunted by the irretrievable losses and tragedies of her life. Margaret of Anjou breathed her last on August 25, 1482, a turbulent life shaped by war and loss, ending in bitterness and solitude. Margaret of Anjou is a figure whom history often judges harshly. Yorkist chroniclers and contemporary English historians often depicted her as a cruel, arrogant, vengeful woman and the primary cause of the bloodshed in the Wars of the Roses. They branded her with the epithet she-wolf of France, an image reflecting their discontent and fear of a powerful and decisive woman who dared to challenge male authority. Yet a deeper look into her life reveals a woman pushed into extreme circumstances, forced to wield power while her husband was incapable of ruling. She fought relentlessly to protect the crown for her husband and the future of her son, displaying unparalleled courage, resilience, and fierce maternal love. Despite the gender limitations of her age, Margaret demonstrated an impressive ability to mobilize resources, rally allies, and even direct military campaigns effectively, a rare feat for women of that time. Her life is a testament to the indomitable spirit of a woman against the most brutal adversities, a tragic epic of power, love, and loss during one of the most tumultuous periods in the history of the English kingdom.
After a long journey through the harsh pages of history, where we have together explored the dark corners of humanity, marveled at the extraordinary lives of khans and warriors, encountered timeless wisdom, and even delved into the mysteries of nomadic medicine, now the distant thunder of hooves has faded, and the heroic epics have settled into the depths of memory. Our video is drawing to a close, and I will gently guide you to a new space, a space of absolute tranquility, where the worries of the modern world melt away, giving way to the stillness of the night and the gentle rhythm of the universe. Allow your body to completely relax. From the top of your head down to your heels, feel each muscle unwinding, every tension dissolving. Take a deep, deep breath into your chest, feeling the fresh air fill your lungs. And as you exhale, let every worry, every trouble of the long day drift away with that breath. Don't try to think about anything. Simply feel. Take a deep breath, not the intense fragrance of wildflowers blooming brightly in the daytime sun, nor the musty smell of old books piled high in a library filled with dry knowledge that sometimes keeps you awake. But this time, feel the scent of everyday medieval life, a rustic and authentic fragrance that has faded into the winds of hundreds of years ago. It is the smell of damp earth after an afternoon rain, the scent of lingering wood smoke in the cool twilight air, the worn leather of a saddle or a suit of armor hanging on a wall, intermingled with the smell of dry grass and occasionally a faint, pungent aroma of distant livestock. This scent is not too distinct, not too strong. It just lingers, vaguely, like an ancient memory being awakened in your subconscious. It is the smell of a simple, real life, of people who once lived, fought, and loved on this land. Let this scent fill your senses, slowly guiding you into a soft dream. Now close your eyes and listen. Listen carefully. Listen to the most subtle sounds of the night, sounds that during the day, amidst the bustle of work and the noise of the city, you were too busy to notice. You might hear the wind whispering through the tall grass on the vast steppe, creating a very soft rustling sound, like a steady, ceaseless lullaby of boundless nature. Perhaps it's the timid sigh of a young horse in its sleep, or the distant chirping of a nocturnal insect, crickets of the night playing their own wordless symphony, steady as the beat of nature's great heart. Every sound is a note in the symphony of stillness, drawing you deeper into a state of relaxation. All the noise, all the worries, all the tensions of the outside world vanish into thin air, leaving only you and the endless peace enveloping you. Now take a sip of warm tea. Feel the warmth of the cup in your hands. Feel the slight bitterness and gentle aroma of the tea slowly spreading through your palate, soothing every sense. And then close your eyes and feel the quietness encompassing you, slowly drawing you into a drowsy, semi-conscious state where all boundaries between reality and illusion become blurred. Now let your mind gently drift, passing over dry grasslands and rolling hills, arriving at an entirely different space, a realm of ancient stillness and hidden beauty. Imagine you are strolling in a small garden hidden behind the formidable stone walls of a medieval castle. The gray, towering stone walls bear the marks of time and stories that have long slept.
This small garden is a verdant oasis amidst the cold stone, a refuge for the soul. You can feel the dampness of the night dew still lingering on the sleeping flower petals, the gentle fragrance of wild roses, of ivy clinging to the stone, and the smell of damp earth. There are no chirping birds like in the daytime, only silence punctuated by the very soft rustling of leaves as a gentle breeze passes through.
Imagine the faint, soft light of early morning struggling to penetrate a small, ancient arched window of a tiny chapel within the castle or a tall tower room. The first rays of the new day, delicate and trembling, cast long streaks across the cold stone of centuries-old walls. That light carries a pristine beauty, like a promise of a new beginning, yet it does not disturb the profound stillness. The castle is so quiet that you can almost hear the dust clinging to old tapestries falling, the worn stone beneath your feet as you walk ever so lightly. The wind whispers through the empty corridors, blowing through unglazed windows, creating a murmuring symphony that echoes in the sacred space, as if ancient spirits are breathing and telling tales in their sleep. Each whisper of wind is like a long sigh of time, of history that has slept deeply. Take another deep breath, but this time feel the scent of dried herbs in the air, mingled with the lingering smell of soot from a long extinguished fireplace. That is the scent of ancient scripture pages slowly crumbling on wooden shelves, of candles that have burned down to their wicks in wrought iron holders, of prayers that have flown into the void, yet still leave a sacred aftertaste. The dried herbs, perhaps lavender hung from the rafters, rosemary strewn on the stone floor to deter insects, or chamomile used to brew soothing tea, all blend together, bringing a sense of cleansing and profound peace. The smell of soot from the fireplace recalls cold winter nights when fire warmed the guards or monks diligently copying manuscripts. Now only residual warmth remains, a lingering taste of past coziness, a stillness born from all activity having ceased. That scent is not the vibrancy of the present, but the essence of the past, of time that has slept within every stone, every timber of the castle. Listen very carefully to the familiar sounds of a medieval morning slowly awakening, yet still deep in slumber. Footsteps on the frozen ground outside the castle gate, the heavy boots of a patrolling guard, each step echoing clearly in the still air of dawn. Further still, you might hear the distant hoofbeats of horses, regular and rhythmic, perhaps a nomadic group beginning their journey, or a messenger hurrying across the grasslands. That sound is gentle and faint, not disturbing the peace. And then a deep, resonant sound will emanate from the horizon, the solemn church bells chiming the hour. The bells ring far and wide, spreading through the crisp morning air, each chime a reminder of the passage of time, of prayers that have taken place for hundreds of years. That bell sound is not the hustle and bustle of life, but the slow heartbeat of an ancient world, an invitation to contemplation. Close your eyes once more, feeling the warmth of the cooling tea in your hands, the scent of the steppe, of the desert,
of the sea, and now of the ancient medieval castle, all blend together, drawing you into a deep, dreamlike state. All earthly burdens vanish. You are no longer just a listener, but a part of the landscape, a spirit hovering between space and time. Feel your body sinking down, every muscle completely relaxing, becoming heavy yet incredibly light. Your breath becomes steady, deeper, guiding you into a state of complete relaxation, free from any worries or tensions. You are drifting on a peaceful river of time, flowing past glittering fields of stars, mysterious sand dunes, soothing waves, and now ancient stone walls. Let the whispering wind and the scent of history guide your way. Night has fallen deep, embracing you. Sleep is descending. Sink deeply into this profound peace, allowing your mind and body to rest completely, ready to welcome a new day with renewed energy and a serene soul.
Our story has gently concluded, softly dissolving into the tranquil night. Every message has been whispered, much like closing the final page of a beloved old book. Now is the time to pull up your warm blanket, lower your screen, and completely let go of your mind to drift into a deep sleep. If you found any peace on this journey, please don't hesitate to like, subscribe to the channel, and share your feelings in the comments. Let us know what touched your soul the most and when. We wish you a peaceful sleep and a gentle night.